Welcome back to Train Signal's VMware vSphere 5 training. You're watching vCenter 5 configuring your new virtual infrastructure lesson. Alright, so we built this great virtual infrastructure. Well, now it's time to configure it. Now it's time to do the post-installation configuration that would complement everything that we've done so far. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about, what do we need to do from a planning perspective. There are certain things that we need to address, like naming conventions, like configuring proper time, etc., etc., tweaking the environment so that it's exactly the way we want it. We're going to then move on to talk about, well, how do we add a data center? How do we add a folder? How do we add hosts? Why do we need to have these different layers of inventory organization, per se? We're going to then move on to talk about configuring the vSphere licensing. Where do you go to configure that in Virtual Center, so on and so forth. We're going to talk about removing the Getting Started tab. Now, for some of us, the Getting Started tab is, it doesn't annoy, it doesn't bother. For those of us that, have come from the earlier days of ESX, the 2.4 days and the 2.5 days, for whatever reason, that Getting Started tab just gets on our nerve. So I'm going to show you where you can go to disable it. You don't have to see it ever again. We're going to talk about configuring the ESXi server clock and NTP service, so that if you have an NTP server on your network, maybe there's a switch that's acting, that's delivering time to the entire network. That's where I'm going to show you where you can go so that you can point to it. We're going to talk about some of the vCenter server settings and plugins. I'm going to show you where that's all in vCenter as well. We're going to talk about reviewing the system logs. We're going to talk about vCenter sessions and about the service status, the virtual center services. Are they running? Are they not running? What type of state are they in? And then we're going to talk about monitoring the ESXi host health hardware status. So I got a very, very cool lesson. There's not a lot of slides, so let's go right through it and then get into the demo portion of the lesson. All right, so planning the virtual infrastructure. There's a few things that you need to do for proper maintenance or proper organization of the virtual infrastructure. Primarily, what I want you to start off with is proper naming and organization of the virtual infrastructure structure, if I can call it. That's going to be critical. It's going to be critical because you want that consistency across all your different hosts. So you want to have a proper naming convention for the hosts. You want to have a proper naming convention for your virtual machines. And there's a different number of reasons why you would want to have a good naming convention for virtual machines. But one of the reasons is that so that you can identify those particular servers as virtual rather than physical. So I'm gonna in the next few slides I'm gonna give you a naming convention system that I've used in the past, just in case you don't have one or you've been tasked with developing one. I'm going to make it a little easier for you and give you what I've been using over time. We're also going to develop or organize by physical site, by company division, and the reason we're going to put all of this organization in place is because at a later time we want to talk about, well, how do I give role-based access to the virtual infrastructure? See, everything that you're doing now, you can consider that the building blocks for what's going to come later. So you're going to build the virtual infrastructure, you're going to prepare it, and you're going to organize everything in folders so that later on, when you want to give access to the virtual infrastructure, it's very easy. If you're giving access to the accounting department, you go to the accounting folder and you give Active Directory access there so that when the accounting personnel log in for whatever reason to the virtual infrastructure, they only see accounting related servers that you've dropped into the right place. So organizing the virtual infrastructure is critical in order for you to be able to manage it properly moving forward. Now, from a virtual center inventory perspective, it's important to understand and know what you can do at what level of the inventory. So at the very, very root level of the inventory, you can create a folder or you can create a data center. Now, the reason you would create a folder is that so you can put a data center in it. The data center is the first object that you have to create within Virtual Center that would then allow you to create clusters and resource pools and hosts and add virtual machines, etc. But in some instances, you might want to create a folder and add the data center inside of that folder. So depending on how you're trying to organize, let's say you are in multiple countries, and each multiple country, let's say you're in Europe or you're on a continent. Let's not say you're in a country. In a continent, you might want to create Europe in a folder, and then under the Europe folder, you can create Paris, London, or even you can go higher to the different countries. You can create the Americas and then go US and Canada, etc., etc. So depending on how you organize it, you either start with a folder or you start with a data center. Typically, unless you're a very global organization, the first object that you would create is a data center. Now, folders can contain another folder, so a subfolder, or a data center, as I've been mentioning. The data center is what can contain, again, folders can go up and down all the way, right? But that's what you can create clusters in, that's where you can create hosts, and that's where you can create virtual machines. Now, the one thing that I want to note here, which is very important, depending on the view that you're in within Virtual Center, you can organize your virtual machines within folders or you can't. Now, when we get into Virtual Center, I'm going to show you what I mean by that, because what happens is a lot of people, when they're in the hosts and clusters view, they try to create folders so they can drop virtual machines in there, and they can't find a folder, so they start creating resource pools and use resource pools as folders. We want to try to avoid that, and I'm going to show you how to do that later on. Alright, so if you don't have a naming convention system that's already in place, or if you've been tasked with creating a naming convention system, I'm going to show you what I've been using over the years. Now, you can take what I have and modify it to meet your needs, or you can take it exactly the way it is. Now, I've created a large Word document for all my customers. When we go in, I give that to them, and they either adopt it or they change it. So if you guys are interested in what I've put together, the Word document that I'll provide is more elaborate. Drop me a note on Twitter. It's at @eknacer. That's my Twitter handle, and I will email you the Word document that pretty much lists how to use this naming convention, but I'm going to walk you through it here real quick. So in very basic terms, this is what it would look like. This is what the server, the switch, the router, whatever device that you have in your environment would look like. GGLT-AAA-BBB, ##, or number. Now, what does this stand for? Now, you'll notice that this is broken down into 3 sections. The first section is known as the header portion, and it ends here. This is the delimiter that breaks off the sections. The second section is called the variable portion, and that ends right about before the numbers start, or the unique ID, and then the third section is the unique ID. So how does this work? So GG will stand for geographical location. So for example, if you're in Chicago, you can go CH, or you can go, maybe you want to go with the state and you go IL. Now, if within Chicago, for example, you have multiple locations, then you would want to create a letter for those multiple locations. For example, let's say you've named one of your data centers EDC, or let's say you've named one of your data centers Navy Pier. So it might be N, so it would be CH. N would be the start of this. Now, the T stands for type. What type of a server is this? Is this a virtual server? So it would be V. Is this a physical server? It would be P. Is this a cluster server? It would be C. And then you have the delimiter here that is sort of like dividing these 2 sections. Now, the AAA will stand for function, service, purpose. What is this server? Is it an exchange server? Is it a file server, a domain controller? What is it? The BBB will stand for the application. Sometimes you have a server that has a function and a service and a purpose. Let's say you have a Citrix server. Now, that Citrix server also has an application that's installed on it. So you want to be able to further amplify the name so that it tells you what it is. So it could be the AAA could be CTX for Citrix, and the application could be, for example, CRM. So you can put CRM for it, or it could be JD Edwards for Oracle. Whatever the case might be, you can do that, and then you have a 2-digit sequence. Now let's take a look at some examples on what this would look like. Some of the examples that I have up here, you'll notice that I have CH stands for Chicago. E is the location of my Chicago data center, and it stands for EDC. And again, in your Word document, all of these conventions here, all of these letters, you have to make sure you put them in there and you define them so that anyone that takes a look at your naming convention document understands what these letters stand for. This is a virtual server, so it's V. It is a domain controller, so I did DC. Now, I did put 3 letters in there. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3. So the AAA here, it's not 3, it's 2, so it's a domain controller. And then it's 01. I don't have BBB here. And I have a quick explanation. Down here, it's almost the same thing, except it's a file server. So you can see where that goes. Now here, it's Exchange, and I've used 3 letters to notate Exchange, but I still don't have BBB. And here it's an ESX server. So again, I just put ESX and then 01. Now down here, it gets a little more interesting, right? So I have CTX, and then I have JDE for JD Edwards, and then 01. So you can read this as Chicago. It is in the T data center, which could stand for test data center, or it could be your lab, for example. It's a virtual server, CTX JDE 01. Up here, it's again Chicago. It's in the E data center. It's a physical server, ESX 01. So this is a way for you to create this naming convention system for your organization. Again, if you don't have this document, you don't have a naming convention, or if you've been tasked with one, drop me a note. I will send you mine, and then you can modify it, butcher it, do whatever you need to do with it. All right, so what are we going to do as soon as we log into Virtual Center? Now, when we log into Virtual Center, it's going to be completely empty. So we're going to have to create certain things. So we're going to go ahead and create 3 data centers. We're going to create Bend, Oregon. We're going to create Dallas, Texas, and we're going to create Hilton Head, South Carolina. So we're going to create these 3 data centers and put them within our virtual center. Then we're going to add hosts. We're going to create a cluster, and we are going to add some virtual machines and see where things go. So if you guys are ready, let's go ahead and switch to Virtual Center. All right, so we're inside of our Virtual Center server. And you'll notice that on the left here where my inventory is, I don't have anything. I haven't created anything yet. So the options are, if I right click right now, you'll notice that I can create a new folder, and I can create a new data center. So it's exactly the same thing we talked about during the presentation. So if I was responsible for a global organization that resides in multiple continents, for example, maybe you break it down by continent. North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Australia, whatever the case might be, and then you break it down by country. You can break it down by city. After that, you can get very, very granular with that. So you can create a folder, and then you create data centers underneath. For my purposes, I don't need to get that granular. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and create 3 data centers. My organization is sort of small to mid-size, so I don't have a lot of locations, but I do have 3 data centers that I want to take care of. So the first thing I want to do is right-click. We're going to click on New Data Center, and we are going to name this data center Bend, Oregon. And then we're also going to create another data center, and we are going to call that Dallas, Texas. Whoops, if I could spell. And then we're going to create the third and final one, and we're going to call it Hilton Head, South Carolina. All right, so that's as far as my data centers are concerned. We've just created 3 data centers. Now, when you create data centers, again, you have the option of creating folders underneath each data center. So you can create a folder if you choose to do so. You can create clusters, or you can add hosts immediately at the data center level. So again, depending on how you want to configure it. So for example, if you had maybe multiple locations within Hilton Head, South Carolina, maybe you would want to create a folder and then add clusters within the folder. Or maybe you just want to add the host directly, or maybe you just want to create a cluster and add the hosts directly there. In my case, I only have 1 data center, but I might have multiple clusters within the same data center. So what I'm going to do is create my first cluster. And for the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to call it HADRS cluster. We're going to keep it simple. I'm not going to enable any of those features at this point, but I want to make sure that I'm planning my virtual infrastructure accordingly. So I want to create that cluster ahead of time in anticipation of enabling these enterprise features. We're going to click on Next. I'm going to keep the level of vMotion at disabled. So what you can do in this screen, and we'll cover this in greater detail when we talk about vMotion, is if you want to add multiple hosts within your clusters, and these multiple hosts come from different CPU families, like different Intel families or different AMD families, using the EVC mode allows you to sort of use the common denominator, the most common denominator across all of the CPU families. So it sort of standardizes on the most common denominator and allows vMotion to take place. Because I know that all the hosts I'm going to add are the same hardware generation, I'm going to keep this disabled for now. Over here, it allows you to store the swap file in the same directory as the virtual machine, or you can store it differently if you wanted to. For my purposes, we're going to store it with the virtual machine, which is what's recommended anyway. So we're going to click on Next, and when you're done, we're going to click on Finish. This will create the cluster. So now that I have a cluster, I can then, within the cluster, right-click. I can add hosts, which is the only thing that you can do at this point within a cluster. Now, the reason for clusters, and we'll explain that later, but the reason for cluster is so that I can aggregate the different physical resources from multiple ESXi hosts that I add, so that I can use all the memory and the CPU and so on and so forth. So we're going to go ahead and add a host here. So I'm just going to click on Add Host. And once this is up, we're going to use the fully qualified domain name just to adhere to best practice as we've been talking. So my first host is esx1.wiredbraincoffee.com. You're going to put the root username and password here so that you can add this particular host to your cluster. It's going to prompt you, are you sure? Feel free to read this. I am sure, thank you. Now I have several virtual machines that I have created in anticipation of all of this ahead of time on that particular host. It's listing them here. I do want to import them. As far as from a licensing perspective, you can license your ESXi hosts at this stage, or you can choose to go with the evaluation version and then add a license key at a later point. I will show you where to do that, but you have multiple options and multiple stages at which you can add a license. So I'm going to keep this right here at default. Click on Next. You can enable lockdown mode so that you can only access this particular ESXi host from the vSphere client, and that's it. No SSH, no VMA, nothing. Just from the vSphere host. If you wanted to do that, you can enable lockdown mode. For my purposes, I'm going to keep that one disabled for now, and we're going to click on Next. And when I'm ready, you're going to click on Finish. It'll take a few seconds, and it will add this particular host to the cluster. It will initialize it, make sure everything is there, go through all the regular checkups that it needs, and then bada bing, bada boom, the host is added into your cluster, and you'll see that you have all the particular virtual machines that you want. Now what I want to do is I want to add a second cluster here, or I want to add a second host. So I'm going to right click the cluster again, and I'm going to click on Add Host. This time we're going to do esx2.wiredbrain.coffee.com. Root. Yes, there's really not much to see here. You notice I don't have any virtual machines on that particular host, so it doesn't list anything. We're going to keep the licensing, evaluation, no lockdown mode. Next, finish, bada bing, bada boom. It's going to add the second ESX host now into my cluster. Now let's go ahead and take a look at where I can go to manage the time for the particular ESX host. So what I want to do is, let's go ahead and select number 2 at this point, and you'll see here that we haven't presented any kind of storage to this particular host. So it's basically saying, hey, I don't have any local storage, what do you want me to do? And we'll take a look at how do we add storage, iSCSI, NFS, or Fiber Channel in a later lesson. So I'm not going to go ahead and add it, but I just wanted you guys to, I just wanted to make sure you understood why we're getting this particular warning message here. But once you click on the configuration tab, you can come down here to where it says time configuration, and you'll see that it's listing the time, the date, etc. The NTP client at this point is stopped, so it's not even configured. So what we want to do is click on Properties. You can most certainly change the time manually if you choose to, if you'd like to do so. If you want to enable the NTP client, very self-explanatory. You're going to click on that checkbox. Then we're going to go into the options here for a second. So when you go into the options, you have the ability to configure how you want the NTP service to start. Do you want it to start automatically if any ports are open, etc., etc.? Do you want to start and stop it with the host? What do you want to do? In my case, I want to start it and stop it with the host. I don't want to have to start it manually at all. Now you'll notice that it's stopped, so you'd have to click on Start here if you wanted to enable it, but obviously I'd have to put in at least the IP address of one NTP server before it can start, right? So to do that, you're going to click on NTP Settings. Once you have that, you're going to click on Add, and you can add the IP address of a particular NTP setting or NTP server that you have. Once you add that in there, you can restart the NTP server after you apply the changes. Bada bing, bada boom. Your ESXi host will start to synchronize with a particular NTP server on your network. So it's very, very simple and easy to configure time for your ESXi host. Now, license features here is going to tell you what this particular ESXi host is licensed for. Now, because I'm in evaluation mode at this point, it's giving me a lot of things that I am licensed for. Now, while we're on the subject of licensing, let's go ahead and tackle that as well. So you can tackle licensing any number of different ways, right? I like to go back to the home screen. The home screen is sort of like my hop screen. I like to go back to it because it's sort of like a one hop to anything I want to get to. So if you click on licensing, typically it will list any licenses that you have here, and you can sort them out by product license, by license key, by asset, etc., etc. So you have multiple different ways by which you can change the view of licenses so that you understand what you have from an inventory perspective. So the assets that you have, the license keys, the products, is it vSphere, is it vCenter, what license key are you using, what asset, etc., etc. So very simple. You click on manage licenses up here. You enter the license key that you typically would get via an email from VMware or off of the VMware website. You download it, you enter that particular key here. As soon as you start to click, you will be able to click on just add license once you've reached the number of characters that is correct. With the correct, obviously, you're not going to put what I put in there. But once you have the correct alphanumerical key, you'll be able to click on add and click next. It will go through, it'll detect if it's an enterprise, if it's a vSphere Enterprise or Enterprise Plus or Essentials. It'll tell you how many CPUs you have access to. If it's vCenter, it'll tell you if it's standard, so on and so forth. It'll give you details on it. You click on next, it adds it to the inventory. You can also assign it to a particular host or a virtual center. Very, very simple from a licensing perspective. Once you're done, you click on next and finish, and it will list them down here. Now, while we've been hopping back and forth to the home screen, let's go back to the home screen here real quick. Let's talk about sessions. Now, as the administrator, and if you're giving role-based access to multiple users within your environment to come on and log into Virtual Center or the virtual infrastructure, you want to be able to know at certain points during the day who's logged in. Maybe you want to restart the services. Maybe you want to reboot the Virtual Center server. For whatever reason, if you want to know who's logged into your Virtual Center server, you can click on Sessions here, and it will list who's logged in, how long have they been logged in, are they idle, how long have they been idle for, when did they log in, so on and so forth. It'll list their name. Hopefully it's not administrator, otherwise you're going to have 10, 20, 30 administrators. Now what you can do also is, if you know that you're going to have an outage, or if you're trying to deliver a message to everybody that's logged into Virtual Center today, or if you want to change that on a daily basis, you can also set like a message of the day. For example, hey, be careful, Virtual Center is going to be unavailable after 5 o'clock today. For maintenance, it'll be back up at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. So you can put that message and advertise that if something, so that they know that at this point there is a maintenance window that's coming and they are not surprised. You can also disconnect users. So if this person is idle for any number of time and you want to get rid of them, you can just right click on them and terminate that particular session, and that user would be disconnected from Virtual Center. So you can mess around with people too if you wanted to. That's from a sessions perspective. If we hop back to home here, again, you'll be able to take a look at the system logs. So this is a quick way of taking a look at what's going on system-wide within your environment. You can take a look at all of these logs. And while we're on the topic of system logs, if you wanted to export these system logs, whether it's because you're trying to analyze them or you want VMware support to help you with anything, you can click up here on File, and one of the ways of exporting the system logs is you can come up out here to export, and you can just pretty much export them however way you want. You can export the logs, the maps, the lists, the events, whatever you need to export, you'd be able to export it from this particular window. Let's go back to home here, and let's go back into hosts and clusters. So remember I was talking to you about the getting started. So the getting started window is this particular window. Some people hate this window, and it used to be a little more annoying in earlier versions of ESXi and ESX because it always used to come up. It was like this pop-up thing that was just annoying. Now, obviously, you see that you can close this particular tab here, but you'll notice that it's on almost every particular node has a getting started. No matter where you go, a getting started follows you. If it's annoying, if you want to get rid of it once and for all and permanently, what you would want to do is come up here to where it says Edit, drag down to where it says Client Settings, and then under the General tab, you see where it says Show Getting Started tab. You can uncheck that, click on OK, and voila. It just disappears from all the particular tabs or nodes, whatever you have, and it just goes away. So this is just one easy way to get rid of the Getting Started tab. Now, if we wanted to check the hardware status of the underlying hardware where ESXi is installed, if we wanted to check, is everything running okay from a processor, from a memory perspective at the host level, stuff that you used to find out if you went into the ILO, if it's an HP machine or DRAC or whatever. There's ESX and vCenter now give you kind of a snapshot to take a look at the hardware status. And to do that, you're going to select on ESX1 or any particular ESXi host within your environment. And on the right here, you'll see that you have a Hardware Status tab. You're going to click on the Hardware Status tab, and it's going to give you this snapshot of what's going on within the hardware itself. So if everything is okay, you're going to see normal. Otherwise, you'll see warnings at the processor level, at the memory level, and you can drill down into each one of them and see exactly what's going on if there was a problem with a particular processor, for example. If you have particular problems with the DIMMs, the memory DIMMs, it'll show you the memory DIMMs. I have a lot of memory in this host. It's 192 gig. The PCI slots, so you can drill down into every one of them. Now, a gotcha here that you should be well aware of, if you click on the hardware status, this is sort of like a plugin, a background plugin to Internet Explorer. So if you have Internet Explorer Enhanced Security, which is by default enabled on Windows Server 2008 R2 and even on Windows Server 2003, you'll probably get an error message here, that annoying window that comes up that asks you to add this website if it's secure. Now, for those of you that don't know how to disable that, it's under Server Manager here. Make sure you select the top of the root here at the top of the tree. Come down here to where it says Configure IE ESC. Select it and make sure you have it turned off. That way it won't interfere with Virtual Center and in displaying the information that you want in here for the Hardware Status tab. And while we're on the subject of monitoring, and before I move away from this particular screen, you obviously have probably noticed the drop-down menu here. So you can change the views again to take a look at alerts and warnings, at system event logs. So each one that you change here will give you a different type of view. Good for me, I don't have any alerts or warnings, and you can obviously switch that to system events and just get more information. This is a very helpful place to start when you are troubleshooting a particular issue. Now, this is at the ESXi host level. What about at the vCenter level? Now, a lot of you are probably very good Windows administrators to start with, and you probably aren't going to come in to Virtual Center to check the service status of Virtual Center. You're probably going to go to services right away or whatever. However, Virtual Center does give you an easy way of checking on the services. That way you don't have to find them, or you don't have to try to guess what services are associated with Virtual Center. So in order to find that, we're going to go again to the home screen here. It's the easiest way to get to it. And then you're going to click on vCenter Service Status. Once you come in here, you'll notice that if everything is green, then all the services related to Virtual Center must be running. If you have any particular service that is not green, then you obviously would want to take a look at it, try to restart the particular service if you have to, etc., etc. Okay, let's go back to the home screen now. And let's talk about the Virtual Center server settings. So obviously you can access them from here. You can also access them from up here. So if you click on Administration, you can click on vCenter Server Settings. You can access most of this stuff from the File menu as well. I just find it a little more, it's a lot easier for me at least to come to the home screen. It's one hop, everything's visual, it's in front of me. So if we go into vCenter Server Settings here, you have a number of things that you can configure. Obviously, again, you have licensing. So if you wanted to manage licensing from here, you can do the same thing. We briefly spoke about the statistics earlier, and especially about the database calculator here. So I showed you how you can add the number of hosts that you're expecting, the number of virtual machines, and it will tell you how much disk space you need at the database level. Up here, you're basically telling it how to gather the statistics. What are the intervals that you want the statistics to be gathered at? You have all these options and checkboxes that you can choose from. The runtime settings. These settings you would change if you have multiple virtual center servers that are going to participate in the same environment, even in linked mode for that matter. So if you have multiple vCenters, for whatever reason, you would want to make sure that each vCenter server has its unique ID. Be careful if you change this, you'll have to restart the services of vCenter. vCenter server managed IP address, if you wanted to assign a managed IP address for it, it's really not required. You don't have to restart the services after you assign a manual IP address here, a managed IP address. Again, if you wanted to give Virtual Center its name, its fully qualified domain name, again, you do not have to restart the services to do so. So again, just a way for you to manage or give Virtual Center its proper ID or identity. Active Directory, this is how Active Directory configuration is going to happen, default ports, etc., etc. How often is it going to query it? What's the timeout values? Default settings that, for the most part, you're never going to change. Now, mail is important because it is sort of like the building block for all of the alerting system within Virtual Center. So you want to at least give it the SMTP server that you want it to use and the sender account. So this is how you can configure your mail so that your alarms, your SNMTP or SNMP, all of that stuff are going to use the mail settings in order to send these alerts to you. Now, SNMP is, again, pretty self-explanatory. You're going to configure your SNMP traps, how you want them. Do you want to enable them? Do you want to disable them? So on and so forth. It's just all about how you configure SNMP. You can put your public string here. Typically, you have your recover URL. So it's just all SNMP stuff that, based on how you have SNMP set up within the environment, you would have all the relevant information to populate these particular values here. Ports, again, pretty self-explanatory. Unless you really are changing the default ports, you don't want to touch these. Timeout settings, normal operations, long operations, when do you want it to time out, etc., etc. Logging options, what do you want it to log? Do you want it to log informational? You can set exactly what you want the logging level to be at. Again, this is very helpful when you're troubleshooting. Typically, it stays at information. Unless you have a particular issue, then you can come back in here, and typically VMware support, whoever's helping you with that, will tell you what level to set it at in order to gather the relevant information. From a database perspective, again, what's the maximum number of connections that you can do to the database? Pretty self-explanatory here. So you can manage it, change it if you need to. For the most part, I've never had to change this, but just in case. Database retention policy, again, very, very standard stuff unless you really want to change it. If there's a DBA or you have specific policies that you want to adhere to, and then you would come in here and change this. SSL settings. Virtual Center requires verified host SSL certificates. So you saw that message where you click on ignore because it's a self-signed certificate. If you want to get rid of that, one of the ways is you can come in here and uncheck that, or you can give Virtual Center a true certificate, SSL certificate, whether it's from your in-house CA, certificate authority, or from if you're buying something from VeriSign. Personally, I wouldn't buy a VeriSign certificate if Virtual Center is deployed within my network. I would use a local CA if I have access to it, or I would continue to click ignore if it's a self-signed certificate, so it's enough for what I'm trying to do. Now, obviously, if you're deploying it in DMZ, or if there's a security requirement, or if you're in a high secure environment, government, whatever the case might be, you might have to pay closer attention to this, basically. Advanced settings, again, for the most part, you're never going to touch this unless you come across a knowledge base article, unless you're working with VMware support and you've come across some kind of a bug, some kind of a fix. You want it to add to the VPX file here. You would come in here and add the key, the value, click on add. You can also do this manually, but I find it much easier to do this from a GUI interface. So for the most part, these are all the settings that come with vCenter settings. So if I click on cancel here, let's talk a little bit about plugins. Now plugins you access from the file menu. Obviously you figured that out. Up here it says plugins. You right click or click on it. Come down here where it says manage plugins. It's very simple, very straightforward, self-explanatory. These are the ones that are already installed. This is the one that's available. So what happens here is after you install some kind of a third-party plugin or a VMware plugin. So in my case I've installed Update Manager. Now it's not enough to install Update Manager. So remember we installed Virtual Center, we had to install the vSphere client in order to access vCenter, right? So it's the same concept with Update Manager. You install Update Manager, but then you have to install a plugin for the vSphere client so that you can manage Update Manager. And it kind of makes sense, right? So you've installed a third party or a VMware third party component, so to speak, into Virtual Center. You have to extend the capabilities of your vSphere client in order to see that additional functionality that you have. Now doing so is very, very easy. What I'm going to do here is we're going to download that particular plugin and we're just going to run it. Now bear in mind you have to do this for anywhere you've installed the vSphere client. So it's not going to take effect globally. Anywhere you install the vSphere client, you have to also install your plugins. In this case, it's Update Manager. You can also install from Converter or whatever it is that you're installing to manage from within vSphere. It will, for the most part, have a vSphere plugin. Now, once it's installed, it's going to show up here, and you won't have anything else under the available plugins. All right, one last thing I want to show you guys. If we come down here or come back here to hosts and clusters, remember when I was talking during the presentation, I told you that you can create folders, but depending on the view that you're in, you can either add virtual machines to these folders or not. So if you're in the hosts and clusters, a lot of times what people try to do is they'll try to right click on ESX01 here and they'll be like, what happened? I don't have a folder. I want to be able to organize my virtual machines, but I don't have a folder. So what they end up doing is they'll come up here to the cluster or at the cluster level, they'll right click it and say, okay, well, maybe I can create a folder up there, and they can't create a folder up there. So what they end up doing is creating resource pools. Now, resource pools are created so that you can aggregate or so that you can guarantee certain resources for certain virtual machines. So you want to make sure that you're grabbing a certain amount of memory or a certain amount of CPU that you can put on a resource pool and guarantee it for certain virtual machines that might be more important than others in the environment. So what they end up doing is create more resource pools. Now, the fact of the matter is you have to understand where you're at, right? So you're in hosts and clusters. So at this point, the view allows you to organize hosts and clusters. So you can create folders and put hosts in them. You can create folders and put clusters in them. But you can't create folders and put virtual machines in them because you're in the wrong view. Now you can select the inventory here, drag to where it says VMs and templates, or you can go back to the home page and do that. But if you come back in here into VMs and templates, over here you can create folders and organize your particular virtual machines in these folders. So for example, if I was to come up here and say I want to create a new folder and I want to call this folder to operations. Well, at that point you can drag and drop virtual machines into these folders. And as a result, you organize your virtual machines accordingly. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that because I don't want you to use the different features, the different capabilities the Virtual Center and that vSphere offers you the wrong way. If there isn't a need for resource pools, don't create a resource pool. Don't use a resource pool as a folder. I've seen that happen many, many times in multiple environments. They end up with bottlenecks as far as the resources are concerned. When I come in, I'm like, why do you have all these resource pools? Oh, well, I'm trying to organize my VMs. Well, you're using it for the wrong thing. Now, the cluster is your top resource pool. So unless there's a need to break it down, unless there's a need to secure certain resources, to guarantee resources for certain virtual machines, don't use resource pools as folders. And with that, we're going to switch back to our presentation. All right, so let's recap what we've learned in this lesson. We started off by talking about planning the virtual infrastructure. Now that we've installed Virtual Center, now there are certain things that we need to take into account on how to plan for the virtual infrastructure. We talked about naming conventions. We talked about how to organize your virtual infrastructure so that you can give role-based access to the different components within it very easily. We then moved on to talk about, well, how do you add data centers, folders, hosts, what's the correct order, what can you have within a data center, what can you have within a folder, etc., etc. What are the different layers that you can have within your inventory? We talked about how you can configure vSphere licensing. We talked about how you can remove the Getting Started tab and whether or not that's annoying to you or not. Some people it bothers them, others it doesn't. So talked about how you can remove that if you wanted to. We talked about how you can configure ESXi server, this clock and NTP. So if you have a switch, for example, if you have a server that acts as the NTP server for your environment and you want to point your ESX hosts to it so that the time of the ESX hosts are always synchronized with this NTP server. We talked about that as well. We talked about the different vCenter server settings and plugins. What are the different settings, how you add plugins, so on and so forth. Then we talked about reviewing the system logs, vCenter sessions to find out who's logged in, how many people are connected to vCenter. We talked about the service status of Virtual Center. Are the services running? Yes or no? Where can you check? And then we talked about monitoring ESXi host health hardware status. So we talked about, well, how do you take a look if the memory is okay, if the CPU is okay, the hardware perspective of ESXi. Finally, I hope this lesson was informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.